Good evening, everyone. Good evening. And welcome to the History of Art and Architecture Department's 18th Annual Student Symposium. I'm Professor Mark Polad, an Americanist and a modernist art historian. Isn't this a handsome space? Isn't this the perfect space for this event? I think so. First, our very best wishes go out to DPAM's director, Laura Caroline Delara, who has made our department feel like welcome partners in the museum mission. And our great thanks to Dr. David Marzella, Collection and Exhibition Manager, for working with us and for hosting us this evening. Actually, I'm going to invite David to say a word. Would you like to come up, David? Sorry. Or needs to be higher, maybe? There's a little light out.
Can you see here? You're good? Yeah. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to DePaul Art Museum. My name is David Marzella. I'm the Collection and Exhibition Manager here. First, let me say thanks for coming, but also excuse our appearance out there in the galleries. We are currently halfway through installing our new exhibition, which is on loan from Tufts University. Come back in 2 weeks, March 23rd. It's a Thursday. We'll be open from 11 to 7, and you can see the new show. But for now, it's a little bit of a construction site. Just wanted to thank the History of Art and Architecture Department for being with us tonight. As myself, someone who pursued a PhD in the humanities, I have a tremendous amount of respect for the young students who are also doing important and interesting work in the humanities. And I remember 10 years ago myself when I was an undergrad doing precisely these kinds of conferences and colloquia. So I told Mark and everybody that I would drop anything that we're doing here, no matter how much of a mess it is, to have this happen here, because I know this is important for the students and I love to see what young students are working on. At the museum, we try as best we can with the three of us that work here to engage the students as much as possible. We have students that work here at the museum, so if you ever visit, you're going to be talking to students. We have student interns, we have fellowships, we host the symposium, the Art History Club meets here, we host the Art School's BFA show, so we try to be as much of a resource on campus as possible for DePaul students and DePaul community. And with that, welcome everyone and enjoy the evening.
Thank you. Thanks very much, David. The graduating art history majors who will be presenting tonight are all enrolled in the department's senior required capstone course, which I happen to be teaching this quarter. In this class, students choose a paper they've written from any of their previous art history courses. They then revise, rewrite, and polish them into longer research papers and into the talks that they'll give here. You'll see that in terms of their quality, they are very much like those one hears at professional academic conferences. But an equally important aspect of the capstone class has been discussing foundational readings and ideas in art history. And I can tell you the level of conversation and writing by these students this quarter has truly been remarkable. And it's been a privilege to be in the classroom with them, and I've learned a great deal myself. I'd invite you to check out the students' impressive biographies that are printed in the program. They've chosen the theme of critical inquiries for this year's symposium, and indeed, the highly original papers we're about to hear do challenge art historical assumptions and revise the thinking and literature on their various topics. Another pleasure of teaching the capstone course is that I get to hear students speak glowingly about my fellow departmental instructors. In fact, the presentations tonight are very much a testament to their fine, dedicated teaching. Many of our colleagues are here this evening, and welcome, or if they are on sabbatical or traveling or watching on Zoom, welcome to you too. We'd also like to welcome our newest faculty member, although she did attend this event last year by Zoom, which is admirable, Professor Yunchen Liu, who will be introducing the students in the second panel. Welcome. This evening doesn't just showcase our talented majors and engaged faculty, however, it's also meant to celebrate our department's successful alums. And this year, we're delighted to have with us Leslie Moody Castro, who will be responding to the student talks. Leslie graciously visited our class last night and shared her experience and practical wisdom about graduate school, about travel, about curatorial work, and that sort of thing. I'd also invite you to see her impressive biography in the program as well. She's remarkable. She's the ideal of a DePaul and HAA graduate. She's smart, sweet, tough, generous, and she's lived an incredible journey in her post-graduation career. Last night, we were knocked out by all her successes as an independent curator, an art world expert, curatorial entrepreneur, author, and international traveler. And to be here this week, she's come from Mexico City, where she lives. And after tonight, I think you are bound for Spain. That's incredible. Thank you, seriously, for being here with us, Leslie. We can't celebrate you enough. So here's how the evening will progress. Professor Cheryl Bichond, our beloved longtime anchor of the Museum Studies program, will introduce the 4 papers in the first panel. Leslie will then respond to each with comments and questions. There'll then be a brief question and answer period from this audience, but not, I'm afraid, from those watching online. Then we take a 15-minute break, return for the second panel, 3 student papers introduced by Professor Liu, then hear Leslie's responses once again. After that, Professor Mark Delancey, our department chairperson, will distribute awards and say a few words of his own. So we will then treat ourselves to some wonderful food and drinks and conversation. And everyone, before we begin, can I please ask you to silence your cell phones? Me too. Last night in class, did anyone notice my cell phone went off? Yes. Oh, I thought it was so discreet. Okay, that doesn't happen often, but it does. So thank you. Let's get started. Cheryl, can I invite you?
Good evening, everyone. So thank you to Mark Polad for leading and guiding every facet of tonight's event. And thank you to the DePaul Art Museum and to David for hosting this important event for the history of art and architecture and for our students. I can't tell you how delighted I am looking at all of you to be up here introducing the first panel. So, but I'm going to keep my remarks short and sweet so we can move it all along. So we are going to begin with Isabella Saraceno and the paper after this, Someone Else Can Do As They Will, an argument for contemporary Dada in Japan, written in Professor Mark Polad's Duchamp and Dadaism class. So Isabella.
Dada, as we know it, is largely European and, to the public, all about Marcel Duchamp and his ready-mades. Dadaism, introduced after the end of World War I, rejected logic, reason, and aestheticism of a capitalist society, opting for the absurd anti-bourgeois sentiments associated with the movement. Fountain, a porcelain urinal with the initials R. Mutt and the year 1917 crudely painted onto it, is a staple of Art History 101. However, Dada was largely expressed by the printed word, with artists in cities like Zurich, Berlin, and Paris taking an interest in printing little magazines with manifestos describing what Dada was. Little magazines were small publications of artworks and writings by avant-gardists in the early 20th century. Little magazines served as the antithesis to popular artistic conventions of the time, using a cheap material of a pamphlet to collect sketches, poetry, and other Dadaist artworks of the movement. According to Dadaist manifestos, Dada was everything and it was nothing. It was ephemeral. But why do we only hear about European Dada? For it is similar to many long-standing worldviews. The idea that Dada is everything, that it is ephemeral, like nature, is similar in outlook to Zen philosophies coming out of Japan at the same time. A time since the 1850s, when its borders were open for international trade from the West for the first time by Matthew Perry. Japan was dealing with some of the same struggles of Europe, with rapid modernization, and after the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923 destroyed Tokyo and needed to be rebuilt, and with the rise of capitalism to be seen as a world power alongside Europe and North America. Surely, Dada had to have become a sensation in this part of the world, and evidence proves it lasted well into the 20th century. There is compelling evidence that Dada's little magazines had been brought over to Japan. Unlike in Europe, however, these magazines were largely picked up by those without privileges of rich families or history of wealth, like most of the European Dadists had. Jun Suji, one of the pioneers of Dada in Japan, claimed that he used literature to escape his life, saying it was nothing but destitution, hardship, and a series of traumatizing difficulties. Jun Suji was a bohemian in the Japanese sense, a monk, an author, a playwright, a translator, and more. Prior to his interest in Dada literature, he was a radical anarchist, nihilist, and feminist, which was almost unheard of at the time. His interest in what is called egoist anarchism would later see him butting heads with his contemporary Shinkichi Takahashi, a poet. Egoist anarchism meant that an individual did not dedicate themselves to one political ideology, but rather live themselves out without regard to how well or ill humanity may fare. Egoist anarchists did not believe in the state or any rights granted by society, but believed that they should all be abolished. While Suji wanted to end the state, Shinkichi Takahashi's past of living recklessly and being punished by society left him feeling like the state deserved a place in the world, and his life greatly improved after facing prison time. Following World War II, Dadaism was on the rise once again in Japan with the introduction of Neo-Dadaism. Created and ending in 1960, Neo-Dada in Japan, according to Ushio Shinohara in an invitation to the first Neo-Dada exhibition, Neo-Dada was described as the only means for us to avoid being massacred is to become destroyers ourselves. This particular movement sought to push back against Japanese fascism and the up-and-coming museum system that Japan was still developing. Evidence of this art movement, aside from a few works by Shusaku Arakawa, are all but evaporated. Some photographs remain to document these exhibitions, but Neo-Dada has widely eluded museum archiving and achieved its goal of destroying conventions. Decades after the Second World War, Japan rebuilt from their destruction and the atrocities perpetrated on them, and was on the track to becoming an economic superpower in the 1980s. In the contemporary period, we see a rise in Dadaist thought once again. American films like Blade Runner show a hypothetical America of the future heavily colonized by Japan, as it was feared to not only equal America in imperial power, but to overcome it. Then, in the late 80s, leading into the early 1990s, the Japanese economic bubble popped following the rapid post-war growth. Japan's posthumously named bubble economy led to an entire generation of lost children, people born under this popped economy, who felt they had little to no career prospects in life, with no chance of mobility outside of going to school, getting an office job, getting married, and retiring. This life plan was laid out for millions, but with a devastated economy that is still trying to return to what it once was, even today, teenagers, young adults, and the adults who sympathize with them found outlets through the media, using accessible forms of media to create this modern Dada. The modern age of Dada in Japan focuses mostly on the nihilism felt by Japanese creatives and exposing the dark underbelly that Japan as a state tries to stamp out with movements like Cool Japan, a strategy coined in the 1990s to follow the economic bubble burst that would soften Japan in the eyes of the West. Cool Japan was the brainchild of the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry to boost the economy to a foreign market through certain exports. This age of Dada is like the philosophy of the Neo-Dadists of the 1960s, who viewed institutions as a lie in the wake of reformations after World War II. Japan was no longer viewed as an imperial force to be reckoned with by the West, but one that now made high-tech cars at a decent price, anime with scantily clad girls and epic fight scenes, and idol groups made to sell for Japanese audiences. Contemporary Dada, through means of music, movies, and painting, shows off the undesirable parts of Japan that the state attempts to wipe clean from Westerners' memories. In comes Vocaloid. Vocaloid is a vocoder software, a category of speech coding meant to mimic human speech, released in 2004, where imaginary characters sing songs produced by real people, and the software can easily be bought and sold and used to make songs at home. Since it is a vocoder rather than a real person, the songs sound human, but not all at the same time. They use a variety of tones to create sounds that mimic words, rather than singing like a normal person. Based on the tuning of tuning of the coding, the same character or Vocaloid can have a unique sound based on the producer coding the software. This medium of creating music became very popular amongst the contemporary Dadaists as it served as a layer of anonymity when criticizing the powers that be, or as an outlet for their emotional struggles. Most popular amongst these contemporary Dadaists is the producer known as Hachi or Kenshi Yonezu. As an artist, Hachi revealed in a 2015 interview he became interested in using Vocaloid when his outlet for making music in a band fell through, but still desired to make music on his own. In the same interview, Hachi discusses being diagnosed with autism later in his life and how it impacted his career. He maintained a lax attitude of it, saying he was always felt outcast and that society was tiresome and that the diagnosis simply made these feelings make sense. These feelings of being outcast by society, as if everybody knew something was wrong with him, is a driving force of his musical stylings. By far, Hachi's most influential work is the song Matryoshka. This song, with accompanying illustrations by Hachi, is the most popular song produced using Vocaloid. The bright colors, choppy animations, and blank stares of the Vocaloid singers Meg Gumi and Hatsune Miku as they deliver the nonsensical yet whimsical lyrics, "I feel broken apart, throw out your memories too." These are sung after text is shown on the screen in Japanese of the Wikipedia article for Sigmund Freud. The Vocaloid themselves move their head off beat, but really there is no cohesive beat to the song. It's a mishmash of instrumentals, with the one constant being a discordant piano key being hit at random throughout the song. The use of the vocoders, along with the producer's choice to include a random words like malinka to rhyme with kalinka and ma-raid to rhyme with pa-raid, is reminiscent of early European Dada sound poetry popularized by Hugo Ball in Zurich, and possibly even Marcel Duchamp's own clever manipulation of world languages. In terms of its message, Matryoshka's lyrics can be persuasively linked in spirit to Dadaism, as in, all's to be laughed at, hurry, dance with all your foolishness. Another line in this song is a reference to both Dada philosophy and the song itself. It's not a waltz or a tango. It's a new genre all its own, with no discernible beat and a quick tempo. It's meant to be thrown on and danced to carelessly. As the song draws to a close, Miku partakes in her own sound poetry, with no real translation for these songs outside of chu being the Japanese sound for kiss. The tempo picks up with an image of Gumi, the green-haired Vocaloid, bent over at the waist, screaming, tears falling onto the credits of Hachi as the producer and illustrator. Then it abruptly stops as if the producer had fallen to the floor upon finishing it. While the song in particular doesn't show much of the dark side of Japan that Neo-Dada and some contemporaries pushed against, Hachi's song Matryoshka perfectly encapsulates the mania driven by nihilism and an uncertainty about not only the future of Japan, but his own place in society. Kenshi Yonezu, along with other Vocaloid producers, has a vast artistic history inspired by many movements, including Dada. The history of Vocaloid and the songs within it are always evolving with the times and becoming even more intricate since its creation in 2004. There's no denying that, knowing now the history of Dada in Japan and its popularity among individuals in Japanese society, that it would become popular again following the economic crash of the 1990s. While Japanese Dada is, in its inception, was literary based and Neo-Dada largely ephemeral, the contemporary Dada of the 2000s was largely influenced by media, particularly music, that would be archived via the internet. It was easily adapted and spread. Anyone could go to the electronics store and buy a version of Vocaloid that allowed them to write and produce their own songs, regardless of prior training or vocal ability. The internet, much like the little magazines to come from the 1920s, was both educational when making Vocaloid music and full of propaganda either for or against the Japanese state. While Vocaloid is not able to hand out its music videos like a magazine, it was able to send a message cleverly disguised by catchy lyrics and bright, colorful animated music videos. I myself started watching Vocaloid music videos in elementary school, and my interest only grew as I got older and could further understand deeper meanings within the lyrics. This experience was doubtless shared by many Japanese and American youth, as Vocaloid becomes even more popular amongst fans of all backgrounds who can relate to these songs. In the end, Dada is about making a statement, whether it be a political one like Berlin or having fun like New York, or coming to terms with the conservative, unsure world of Japan. These artists from the 1920s into the 2000s made that statement in their poetry and songwriting. It's about seeing the world be built, torn down, and then making sense of the world amidst the rubble, time and time again.
Yes.
That one?
That's perfect.
Okay. Better? Okay. Thank you, Isabella. Our second speaker tonight is Kara Zubo, and she will read her paper, Syncretic Expressions, Diego Rivera's Day of the Dead Murals, written in Professor Delia Cosentino's Special Topics Day of the Dead course. Thank you, Kara.
Mexico's Day of the Dead celebration has become a globally recognized and primary symbol of Mexican culture. This global recognition, however, was not by accident, but a conscious syncretism by post-revolutionary artists at the beginning of the 20th century. Following the Mexican Revolution of 1910 through 1917, a newly established Mexican leadership realized the importance of investing in their nation's artists to meld Mexico under a single unified identity. A representative of Mexican and global culture in his own right, Diego Rivera was the activist, post-revolutionary muralist, passionately involved within the discourse of the shifting political power. With the devastating civil war behind them, a sense of community needed to be rebuilt. The muralist painters of Mexico, Rivera included, were able to assist in achieving this unifying goal. It was very important to highlight the cultural assimilation of Spanish and indigenous influences on Mexican culture. Rivera and fellow artists were keen on cultivating and protecting this Mexican history. Rivera, one of a number of revolutionary artists of the time, used murals to syncretize the colonial Spanish and indigenous Aztec influences in which Mexican culture is rooted. Indejisimo, as it is called, is an eclectic approach, including principles of the glorious Mexican past and popular arts, as well as the classical European culture. From a political perspective, this amalgamation of classical European tradition with the imperialism of the Aztecs grants Mexico this unified culture. When Mexico gained a unified single identity, trust in the government increased, further strengthening the state. The Day of the Dead then became a tangible syncretism informed by the philosophies of mestizaje and indejisimo, Mexican pride, and, by association, Diego Rivera himself. Indejisimo and mestizaje emerged following the revolution, categorizing Mexicans as members of a single cosmic race. Indeed, the cosmic race was a philosophy and book written by the Secretary of Education and prominent commissioner of the Mexican muralist, Jose Vasconcelos. It states that world cultures would increasingly mix and eventually give rise to a new human type, forming the best of each culture. This idea is incredibly utopian, but Vasconcelos believed that all the ingredients necessary for this new humanity were present in Latin America. Latin American nations possess vast land and natural resources, as well as customs, traditions, and cultures that endowed an originality and uniqueness to each. which Vasconcelos suggested meant that European states could not displace these Latin American countries or their citizens. Both philosophies represent the syncretism of Mexico's layered history and culture. In this genre painting, meaning the depiction of everyday people unengaged with the viewer, the Day of the Dead showcases a plaza brimming with celebrations of the Day of the Dead. Beginning in the background, Rivera depicts 3 larger-than-life calaveras, or skeleton figures, each playing a vihuela, mariachi-style guitar, dressed in the clothing of farm workers. The vihuela dates back to 15th century Spain and is a byproduct of Spanish hybridity within the fabric of Mexico. Behind these 3 skeleton figures, 2 poles support skulls adorned in modern accessories, such as hats or red makeup. Smaller, plain skulls are stacked below in a pyramid emulating the sugar skull, a traditional sweet treat made of moldable sugar mixtures, most frequently shaped into a skull. Sugar skulls are placed on ofrendas, an altar space created for the Day of the Dead to honor both those who have departed and to enjoy as a part of the celebrations. Variations of sugar skulls and expansive feasts are present in 16th century codexes of Aztec culture. The Codex Florentine, created by Spanish Franciscan friar Bernardino Sayón, serves as a record for the indigenous practices prior to Spanish colonization. Folio 22 of the Codex depicts the Tepotitl, a feast honoring the dead, a celebration similar to the modern Day of the Dead. The Tepotitl, or the small dough ones being distributed at the feast, were sacred edible objects that often included artifacts linked to the departed inside the dough. 2 busts are depicted in the background, with scholars linking this to an early example of an ofrenda. Art historian Hugo Nuti states, "For a transient moment, the living and the dead are joined in a shared existence. This tradition of Tepotitl lives on through the sugar skulls, which continue the values of honoring and connecting with the dead through the sacred food. This is modernized by Rivera with his syncretism of Aztec feasting practices within a contemporary early 20th century Mexican context." We turn next to perhaps the most renowned Mexican printmaker of all time, José Guadalupe Posada, to investigate popular Day of the Dead depictions. Posada's calaveras, or skeleton drawings, are iconography heavily associated with Day of the Dead and the Mexican working class. Posada's prints are highly recognizable, as they reach millions of Mexicans through cheap newspapers and penny prints. This expansive viewership, predominantly by the working class, led Posada to be regarded as becoming the spokesperson for the collective Mexican soul. The Calavera personification of death is not new, though, as it can be traced to European roots. The personification in particular is traced to the 15th century woodcuts of Hans Holbein's Danse Macabre, a series of prints depicting death as a figural skeleton meddling in the lives of mortals. Danse Macabre prints gained popularity in the 18th and 19th century France, a time where Mexican leadership was heavily invested in the replication and expansion of French culture into Mexican. The prints were exported to Mexico during the reign of President Porfirio Diaz. In a Francophile atmosphere, Posada would easily be exposed to this imagery, thus influencing his artistic choices and later on Mexican art overall. Directly in the foreground of the image, 2 women stand with their backs turned to the viewer. Both women appear to be distributing food to the crowd, but their clothing and hairstyles differ. The woman on the right is dressed in a yellow, form-fitting dress with ruffles on the bottom. Her hair is neatly pulled back into a slick back bun, and she wears white stockings and silver high heels. All of these fashion trends, short hair, stockings, and strappy heels, are of the 1920s, most commonly the Western world's 1920s. Think of Zelda Fitzgerald and what she would have been sporting in her heyday in Paris, a woman of Rivera's global circle. A similar case can be made for the woman on the left with her back turned, dressed in a full-length patterned skirt, white blouse, apron, and 2 braids connected at the end. This braided hairstyle, or trenzas in Spanish, is depicted in other works Rivera made outside of the Day of the Dead. It is considered a traditionally indigenous women's hairstyle. Professor Zuni Cruz discusses her personal significance to her family's indigenous roots via braiding, saying, "The mestiza identity is a woven identity. We weave topics and it fits really well into personal significance. And using this particular metaphor fits my experience as an Indian person, and giving my background means a lot to me. I use this metaphor, I think of my relatives that have gone on, my male relatives who wore braids. It is a link to my grandfather and to my brother. It is a perfect description of the process of what we have been through and what we continue to go through." The Day of the Dead was commissioned by the Minister of Public Education, Jose Vasconcelos, in 1924, and is located in the Secretary of Public Education's headquarters as part of a larger series spanning across the building. Rivera's paintings were commissioned during a time of new political regime under President Alvaro Obregón, contextualizing this mural as innately connected not only to the values Rivera held himself, but to the goals of the new Mexican government. Day of the Dead then became a tangible syncretism informed by the philosophies of mestizaje and indígena, and by association, Diego Rivera. He was a post-revolutionary painter who used his paintings to encourage this indígena and mestizaje interpretation of the Day of the Dead. As such, it became a vehicle to promote political unity among the Mexican people. Diego Rivera used the painted image to strengthen the country of his origin and his pride, Mexico. Through insightful representations of the past and inclusions of the ever-globalizing world, Diego secured the foundations for Day of the Dead to be an internationally recognized celebration that serves as a symbol of national pride, practice, and unity. This could not have been accomplished without the support of the Mexican government, which was actively willing and in need of the vision Rivera had in mind. Though one of many muralists of his time, Diego Rivera crafted his paintbrush to erect political and social movements in a uniquely syncretized, uniquely Mexican style. In his own words, "I know now that he who hopes to be universal in his art must plant in his own soil. The secret to my best work is that it is Mexican." Thank you.
Thank you, Kara. Our third speaker is Nora Ryan. She will present her paper, Passion and Pain, Francisco Goya's Rise to Modernity, written in Professor Maren Sullivan's 19th century European art class. Welcome.
All right, hello, everybody. When the development of modern art is discussed, there is frequently a focus on technical experimentation by artists. Francisco Goya, who is sometimes referred to as the father of modern art, did play with techniques in his work, especially in his later Black paintings, but what I argue brings him to modernity is his subject matter. Around the turn of the 19th century, after his lighter Rococo era and stint as the appointed artist for the Spanish court, Goya began making demanding works which emphasized social and moral issues. This focus on his figures and what he was witnessing in society is the linchpin of Goya's art. His willingness to push boundaries and to think about his world in a new way is what separates him from the other great romantic painters of his era. Indeed, perhaps surprisingly, clear connections can be drawn between his work and that of the Surrealists a century later when considering their inspirations and their 1924 manifesto. In 1799, Goya created one of his most famous projects, Los Caprichos, or The Whims. This series of 80 prints were meant to be a reflection of the absurdity and cruelties of society. Goya aimed to critique the ignorance, superstition, and vanity which he saw around him through bitter satire aimed at both the government and the church. These prints are twisted and fanciful, showing creatures outside of reality, ones that signaled Goya's increasing personal darkness. The prints rely on darkly inked sections, and details show decrepit humans and animals snarling at the viewer, as seen, for example, in El sueño de la razón produce monstruos, or the sleep of reason produces monsters. The realistic nature of Los Caprichos pushes Goya's creations into another dimension. The figures are both fantastic and realistic. both recognizable and jarring, a juxtaposition of life and nightmare. Goya was aiming to express what he believed to be the truth around him and use fantastical creatures to create something inventive, something which pushed the boundaries of how morality and society could be depicted without simply replicating something from life. Almost 2 centuries after Goya created Los Caprichos, Salvador Dali reinterpreted the series by adding his own surreal elements, overlaying new color and changing the original titles. Dali had long admired Goya's work, and in the early issues of Stadium, the magazine he created with friends, Dali mentions Goya as one of the great masters of painting. Dali writes that he admires Goya's curiosity and ability to show the quote-unquote desires and aspirations of his people. While some of Dali's changes were subtle, others were much more dramatic. Goya's original self-portrait, in the first print in Los Caprichos, is fairly simple, showing only the artist. However, Dali's reinterpretation shrinks Goya's portrait and places it within the outlines of the neck of a larger animal. The creature is distinctly Dalian in its build, with a drawer projecting out and a sharp face. The addition of wings is a nod to the frequency which winged animals appear in Goya's originals. Dali also uses the lines of Goya's shoulder and hat to incorporate his face into the body of the creature, thus blending the two together. As this is the first image that appears in Goya's Los Caprichos, this could signal the way in which Dali planned to blend his work with that of the Spanish master by choosing to drastically change Goya's self-portrait and add elements that are distinctly reflective of his own work. In scholar Ian Gibson's book on Dali and his life, he notes that Goya's etchings became a quote-unquote vehicle for his secret obsessions, composed in a variety of familiar motifs. Thus, Dali's reinterpretation shows that he was seeing some of himself and his society in these prints, prompting his work. The timing of Goya's Los Caprichos, just before the well-known and scandalous Maja Desnuda, is intriguing because both show the ways in which Goya was challenging traditional moral norms set by the church. The title loosely translates to nude lower-class woman, and Goya presents her openly staring at the viewer with a slight smile and displaying her pubic hair, one of the first depictions that did so in a non-degrading manner. However, a few years after its completion, Goya was brought under fire by the Inquisition, which sought to destroy art that it found profane or indecent. While the Inquisition deemed it obscene, Maja Desnuda was not destroyed, quite probably because it was Goya who painted it, and by the fact that the commission came from the Secretary of State, Manuel Godoy, for his private collection. Indeed, Goya was willing to be bold in his artwork, and this early example shows the support he had behind him from powerful people, which allowed him to look at society in new ways. Goya was not concerned with the lighter aspects of life that he depicted early in his career. Instead, he now chose to display the darker natures of himself and the people around him, apparently without concern for moral conformity. One of Goya's best-known works, the 3rd of May, 1808, is a look into his radical vision of modern war. Painted in 1814, it depicts French troops mercilessly executing Spanish fighters one by one after the 2 de Mayo uprising, in which the country came together to resist Napoleon's invasion. On the right side of the painting are the French, standing in shadow, faces hidden, and guns aimed at the man with his arms spread. This painting focuses on the event's raw emotional power as these men stare down their own death. Their faces alternate from covering their eyes or ears to looks of pure fear. The French soldiers are a faceless line, while the Spanish civilians are more amorphous and expressive. Art historian Roberto Alford has observed how Goya painted this piece to commemorate the bravery of Spanish patriots while reducing Napoleon's troops to anonymous figures centered around the action of killing. Over 30 years after her analysis, Jerome Brown offers an opposing view. He writes that Goya uses the 3rd of May to capture the split second between life and death, to freeze the very moment before everything changes. He states that rather than showing the patriots as brave, Goya is showing the futility of martyrs and that political reason is brutal and relentless. Brown uses this to argue that Goya felt betrayed by Enlightenment ideals, which the French cultural elite actively preached while they sanctioned the slaughter of Spanish patriots. This analysis is especially interesting when considering the development of surrealism a century later. The surrealists were focused on the dream world and the value of imagination over logic and practicality. In André Breton's 1924 Surrealist Manifesto, he viewed society as overvaluing logic in the service of progress as it abandoned superstition. Goya was clearly grappling with similar ideas about the destructive nature of logic, shown in the uniformed and anonymous line of French soldiers. The French are using reason to justify their killing and attempted conquering of Spain, and thus reason itself becomes relentless. But this does not make martyrdom useless, as Brown suggests. These patriots are victims of fate, as war requires sacrifice, and thus their sacrifice was never futile because it was in service of their country and beliefs. Goya's creation of the painting renders the sacrifice doubly meaningful, as it can now inspire others to fight. Their pain can now inspire passion. Goya himself petitioned the Spanish government in 1814 after the war had ended to paint scenes of resistance, and the 3rd of May became one of the most powerful paintings of his career. The Spanish surely knew the power of Napoleon's troops and the long, difficult fight ahead, but this was not reason to surrender. Breton's manifesto highlights the comfort that can be found in imagination, as people who are viewed as insane become unafraid of punishment, finding comfort instead in the breadth of their mind. The 3rd of May, 1808 shows some of these same ideas. The Spanish fought bravely for their rights, aware of the immense cost, and knowing the strength of Napoleon, they found comfort in their ideology. Goya's choice to depict it in this way, with little focus on the French, shows not only his admiration of the patriots, but also the pure viciousness of war. In 1960, critic Kenneth Clark said of the painting, "This is the first great picture which can be called revolutionary in every sense of the word, in style, in subject, and in intention, and it should be a model for the socialist and revolutionary painting of the present day." If Goya hadn't already established himself before as an artist willing and able to push boundaries, then he did it here, making himself into a harbinger of modernity. These works are, of course, only a small portion of what Goya created during his lifetime. After the war with France, his art continued to become darker and more complex, as evidenced by the Black paintings, right up until his death. This time period in his art, at the cusp of the 19th century, is one which shows his changing mindset as he develops art that is more and more focused on his own expression and experience in the world. This turned from traditional narrative art, driven by the church or by commissions, to an art that reflects the artist and their ideas, is what accounts for modernist experimentation in the latter half of the 1800s. By the time the Surrealists came along, the art world was exploding with possibility as artists tried to process the world around them. Goya grappled with these same issues of trying to make sense of his life and then trying to convey it in a way which people could understand. One quote summarizes the role Goya played in the development of modern art particularly well, a quote which Breton himself uses in his Surrealist manifesto. "You tremble, carcass, but you would tremble more if you knew where I was taking you." Thank you.
Thank you, Nora. Our final speaker for this first session is Isabel Camphor, and she will present her paper, "Godly Bodies and the Quest for Control at the Temple of Zeus at Olympia," written in Professor Lisa Mahoney's Gods and Mortals course.
Okay. Okay, got it. Okay, hi. The Temple of Zeus at Olympia, destroyed in 426 CE, and the Olympic Games that took place on its grounds, has been an infatuation of classicists since the 1800s. The temple itself stood over 87 feet long and 10.5 feet high. Due to the volume of scholarship surrounding the temple, there are numerous contradicting opinions regarding virtually every aspect of the grounds. Scholars agree that the myths represented within the pediments are the Centauromachi and the preparation for Peplop's chariot race. The Centauromachi is a myth depicting the wedding of King Pirithous to his bride Diademia, which quickly turned into a battle between the centaurs and the Lapith people. Whereas the Eastern pediment depicts the myth of a chariot race between Peplops and King Oniamos for the hand of the king's daughter. The point of major contention between scholars involves identifying the main themes of the pediments and metopes. The pediments of an ancient temple are the triangular area formed by the roofline, whereas the metopes are spaces on the frieze between the triglyphs on the interior porch. It is the point of this paper to identify and explain the main themes of the pediments in relation to their imagery. The themes in these pediments and metopes are meant to address the viewer, who at that point was an ancient Greek person. He was notoriously anxious about many things, especially things of an existential matter, which I explore below. In any case, this anxiety bled into Greek art and architecture, and can even be found in their philosophical and poetic writings.
The pediments and metopes of the Temple of Zeus at Olympia include messages that were meant to reinforce societal values of cosmos and Dike through depictions of divine bodies, and warn against the effects of lost control through depictions of mortal and half-human bodies. It is not a difficult undertaking to try and understand the existential dread that accompanied life in ancient Greece. Despite the fact that the Greeks made great progress as a society in the realms of democracy, military strategy, and architecture, one cannot forget that they were without technologies that makes life easier to predict. More than that, they had less information on questions about existence itself, which produced a feeling of dread. These circumstances contributed to an intense amount of anxiety in the average Greek person and Greek society as a whole. Scholar J.J. Pollitt masterfully parses the finer details of ancient Greek anxiety and how it affected art and culture. In his Art and Experience, Pollitt asserts that the intensity with which the quest for order was carried on by the Greeks was exceptional. Whether as a result of some mysterious tendency in the national psyche or as a spontaneous reaction to their turbulent historical experiences after the breakup of the Mycenaean world, the Greeks felt that to live with changing, undefined, unmeasured, seemingly random impressions was to live in a state of constant chaos. The results of the collective anxiety translated into a tireless pursuit for order, and once order was achieved, a dedication to maintaining this order. The nature of Greek society and its obsession with order and justice shows itself pictorially in the pediments of the Temple of Zeus at Olympia. The east pediment of the Temple of Zeus at Olympia depicts the myth of the preparation for a chariot race that would decide who Hippodamia, King Oneamos' daughter, would marry. Prior to Peplop's racing for Hippodamia's hand, 13 suitors had previously tried, failed, and been executed. Peplos, Oneamos, and Hippodamia are the main mortal figures that appear in this composition. Peplos and Oneamos are arranged to the left and right of Zeus respectively. They are flanked by two women who are believed to be Hippodamia and Sterope. The identification of the figures on the pediments comes from the observations of Pausanias. However, his lack of indication of left or right when he described the pediment has made identifying the specific figures more difficult. Despite the fact that Peplops, Oneamos, and Hippodamia are the main mortal figures in this composition, the most important figure is Zeus. He is situated in the middle of the pediment with his hands by his side and his legs arranged in a contrapposto pose. Zeus is depicted as an omnipresent figure with no movement to his arms or body, except for a slight indication of movement in his head and neck. His form takes on an icon-like quality with its utter stillness and intensely grave facial expression before destruction. Scholars have deduced that the direction of movement in his head and neck indicates which figures within the composition he is willing to bestow divine favor upon. Zeus's pose, while not sculpted in the archaic style, encapsulates design features that were popular in the archaic era. There is an air of similarity between Zeus's figure in the Eastern pediment and figures sculpted in the archaic period, the same period where control and order became paramount. The archaic period can be characterized by the emergence of values such as cosmos and Dike. Cosmos referred to a harmonious and ordered air in the universe, whereas Dike referred to the personification of order and judgment. These terms and others refer to the importance of order within society, and by extension the universe, or the danger of pride and chaos. These values translated almost immediately into the architecture of archaic temples, which then carried over into classical architecture as well. The squared shoulders and firm stance of Zeus was meant to reinforce the values that were important in society to the ancient Greek viewer. The expression of stillness in Zeus's figure sets him apart from the other characters in the composition who are caught in a flurry of activity. Despite the fact that the preparations for the chariot race do not exactly represent a chaotic or dangerous scene, it does suggest excitement from all the characters except Zeus. It also exemplifies the purpose that Zeus serves in this scene, a figure representing control. The West pediment depicts the story of the Centauromachi. This was a favorite myth of the Greeks and was frequently depicted on symposium vessels and in mosaics. The Centauromachi tells of a battle between the Lapith people and the Centaurs, which occurred during the wedding of King Pirithous. The Centaurs were invited guests, however, after over-imbibing at the wedding, they attempted to rape the Lapith women, which resulted in the battle. The center of the composition is occupied by Apollo, who is placed there not only to represent the importance of his standing as a god, but also to show him as an invisible divine helper to the Lapith people. He is standing vertically in the center of the composition, and his figure is squared directly to the viewer. Apollo raises his right arm
to shoulder height in a gesture that is meant to indicate a placement of divine favor and a swift, simple victory over the chaos of battle. Prior to the destruction of the temple, Apollo's hand was pointing more specifically at those in his favor. However, the specifics of his gesture have been lost to time. To Apollo's left and right, battle rages. The women of the composition are being assaulted by the centaurs, while the Lapith men with axes attempt to slay the centaurs. The sculptor, who is still unknown, chose to depict the centaurs on the west pediment as entwined with the Greek men and women, despite the fact that the Greeks themselves are non-reactive. This attempt to distinguish the centaurs as wild and the Greeks as reserved is an attempt to remind the Greek viewer of how they should proceed in relation to chaos. Apollo is the only character not engaging in the battle surrounding him. Instead, he simply raises his arm to put a stop to the battle and restore order. Pictorially, this is an obvious strategy to control the chaos present in the rest of the scene. Apollo has the power to end the battle quickly and efficiently, whereas the humans do not. As we have seen, the mythical bodies on the pediments represent the desire for a clean path towards control. The stated analysis of the pediments at the Temple of Zeus at Olympia lends another interpretation to the already extensively examined pediments. But we are now in a position to claim that its two pediments and the depictions of Zeus and Apollo can be understood as communicating the desire and means for control, a quality the Greeks strove for not only in their society, but in their art as well. Thank you.
Hey, I'd like to invite Leslie up to respond to the papers, and actually all the speakers in the first panel, if you could come on up.
Well done, y'all. I know this seems really nerve-wracking, so congratulations. I'm really impressed by the fact that you all have such a great command of your subjects. It's really obvious that you've spent a lot of time on these papers and a lot of time researching these topics. So congratulations, you did a really incredible job. I also know how nerve-wracking it is to be here behind this podium. Isabella, great title. It captures your subject so incredibly, and I found the material really fascinating. I think that one of the things that really stood out to me is that I would like for, my question really was that I wanted to know a little bit more of like the rapid change that the sort of non-Western world was going through. I wanted to know a little bit more about how Japan was being capitalized, if that makes any sense, because this is a totally different economy. And in a way that has a lot to do with colonization. And so I wanted a little bit more about that. I don't know if you want to respond to that now or not.
So basically, post World War II, there was a need to not only rebuild the country, but also to change the view of the country to the eyes of the rest of the world, basically after its association with World War II. So there was rapid economic growth due to just rapid modernization once again that we saw post the borders being open that I mentioned. So we're seeing more and more rapid modernization and these inventions that are getting shipped over to America and other parts of the world, and just also the creation of TV shows, video games, just quickly changed people's idea about Japan and kind of, unfortunately, a lot of World War II history not taught in Japan. And so, they kind of got to change their perception to the rest of the world around in a couple of decades.
I also thought there was a really big time jump. You kind of went from talking about the wars and then went into like the early aughts in the 90s. And I'd like to know a little bit of what happens in the middle. That's a lot of information to say right now, so I don't expect you to respond to that. I just think that there's something that's really interesting there that can be sussed out as well. And I also really like the connection that you made between the little magazines, which you talked about at the beginning of the paper, and then brought it back to kind of the internet and the sort of relationship that those two would have had in popular culture, which also obviously kind of connected everything together to me with the videos and Dadaism back in general. So if you want to comment on any of that or not, it's not really a question. Thank you. Kara, Thank you so much for your paper on Rivera and Day of the Dead. This is a topic that I think is really hard to touch because it's also a really difficult time in Mexican history. And I applaud your attempts to try and sort of narrow that down because it's a really, this history in Mexico is not very concrete and it's really slippery and there's a lot of slippage. I would actually encourage you, and this again is not so much of a question, but a comment. I would encourage you to sort of problematize the time period or position that time period into what was happening around the world as well, because this is Mexico's sort of glory days, right? This is a golden age of like a lot of things that were happening in Mexico that were also in part to this economic growth that was happening. And meanwhile, the rest of the world is coming out of wars, is in middle of wars, is going through a major economic depression. And I think that's a really interesting time that also very much leads into a lot of the conversation about Rivera and Vasconcelos. I will also say I want to challenge you to problematize the Mexican government. There's a lot of sides to the story, and there's a lot of really particular literature that comes out of this time that also sort of glorifies and romanticizes the Mexican government. And so I welcome you to problematize that a little bit. I also encourage you to read the writer George Flaherty, who positions this time in Mexican history in a really interesting way. And I want to ask you why you were interested in this topic in particular.
Well, I'll start with why I was interested in this. I took several classes with Professor Cosentino, which really sparked my interest with Mexican art and the muralist movement. And I took the Day of the Dead class specifically last quarter, not knowing much about it. And I just kind of fell into it. I've now dedicated probably about a year and a half of my academic career to having some sort of like Mexican art class in my schedule, and it's sort of rubbed off. And so I felt that I had a strong paper here. And when you were talking about the timeline, I do agree with you on that. And then in my more extensive paper, I do dive more into the political aspect of it and the problems of that and the repercussions of that, especially within tourism today.
Perfect.
I took that out.
Yeah.
But about the timing of this one, because it was 1924, it's in the wake of World War I. The economy's booming. You know, it's not that it's the wake of goodness around the world, actually. So I mean, there are later ones where it's the Dream of a Sunday Afternoon in Alameda Park, and that is in 1843, I think. So then that is a different representation. 46. That is a different representation, and that one is more geared towards tourism and the aspect of that, and then the influence of fauna later on. But yeah, I have that in the that's in the director's cut.
Gotcha. Yeah, I will say there's from my side, there's a lot of like romanticization on the muralists and Diego Rivera in general, and so I don't want you to fall into that. And I think it's really important to problematize that history for a lot of reasons as well, which is why I asked. Thank you. Yeah. Nora, Goya and Modernity, great paper. Thank you. I kind of have a similar questions to you, and maybe this is also part of the director's cut, but I kind of want to know, in this presentation, I wanted to know what was happening in the world to change Goya's perspective so drastically, from going from something that was so romantic and sort of idealistic and idyllic in many ways to depictions that were so bloody and gory. And I didn't get that as much in the presentation. And so I think that was something that the bigger question that I had was, I know what happened in the world, but I wanted you to talk about that and contextualize that a little bit as well.
Yeah, that's definitely the director's cut. A lot of it is due to the war, obviously, seeing that in his homeland. And then also he was fully deaf by the age of 42. So he's also just very isolated. And that's really when his art started to get darker, is when he went deaf. He was also briefly kicked out of the country and like moved to Bordeaux for a while and came back to Spain. And that's when he did his black painting. So I think there was a lot of turmoil in his life, and he struggled with multiple illnesses and like poisoning from like lead and mercury just in his art practice. And so I get much more into his health and how that impacted his relationships and thus like his art.
Thank you. Isabel, When I was listening to you talk and I've read your paper, I was really interested in I wanted to know if you have read The Theater of War. So this might actually be something that's pretty interesting for you because it talks about this idea of chaos and trying to control a population. And basically it contextualizes the Greek tragedies in a way that acts as therapy. And I also wonder if some of these images are trying to do the same thing. If it's a not only a quest for control, but also a way in which to contextualize chaos in a way in which people can kind of separate themselves from it and see sort of a bigger picture of, I don't know, something on another side of something that makes any sense. And so I wanted to put that to you. And I was also really interested in, again, contextualizing this chaos. Again, this might be the director's cut, what was going on in the world at the time, what was making it so chaotic. And I was also interested in how this could be looked at in a way that maybe could be seen as propaganda.
Yeah, so this it is in the director's cut. But this was from the breakup immediately following the breakup of my city and world. So everything was kind of in chaos. And also this was like the time when there was just a lot of battles going on, some wars. And so it was propaganda too, because it was like the gods were propaganda for not only the Greek viewer, but also the Greek scripture. In a way, it was like, do your duty, be the personification of order and justice and judgment, which is what PK, which I was talking about in my paper. So yeah, not only was it kind of a way to translate chaos into like a pictorial realm, but it was also a way to show the Greek man that they need to do their duty and be swift about it.
I think it's interesting that the topic of propaganda keeps coming up as well. Hasn't really changed much, has it? Do I open it up to questions from the audience? Thank you all.
Some short questions for our speaker, and then we'll take a break. So would anybody like to address a question to the speakers?
I had a question for Isabel. So the J.J. Pollock book, I think there's an interesting observation they made when you touched on the idea that the Greeks have this sort of kind of or potentially, that is my question, I guess, this potentially peculiar kind of allergy to chaos or disorder. And they seem to really be energetically sort of desperate to find order, to impose order. You think, how does that compare to our contemporary relation to disorder or chaos? Are we more or less tolerant of it today?
I think that's something that I found interesting about exploring the idea of like patient anxiety, because I think a lot of the reason they were desperately trying to find order is because they didn't have the things we have now to be able to know, like, oh, there's a big storm coming that could like ruin everything or like stuff like that. So not only like disasters, but also we have social media, we can like keep in touch with people better. But then I also think on the other hand, social media obviously breeds anxiety. But I think it's hard to compare them because I think it's just such different experiences. But I think they were rightfully desperate for order.
Yeah.
So drawing on that question, two of the other papers seem to go in the complete other direction. I mean, there's a lot of anxiety. But your paper is about Greek anxiety, about asserting control and order. And it seems like Nora and Izzy are more what happens when we've asserted order and control. What have we lost? I don't know if there's a question.
Like for mine, just like kind of just talking back at you. It's more like, there's so much control imposed that you're left with anxiety about like, okay, my whole life is planned out ahead of me. What can I do now? And that's when you get creative outlets to kind of be free and anonymous online and get to explore those feelings of like, okay, I'm totally controlled and it's supposed to be less anxiety inducing, but I'm more anxious knowing that like, this is what it is. Yeah.
Agrees to have been happy with those more Japan.
Yeah, I think for Goya, it's probably connected more to the Greek understanding of chaos, because personally, I kind of view his work as trying to process what's going on. Like, there is no control, right? Napoleon told them that they were gonna be allies with the Spanish and try and take over Portugal, and we kind of have the Spanish on that promise. And so I just kind of see it as we're just looking for unity rather than order, just trying to find order in that unity.
Any other questions out there?
I have a question for Kara. In thinking about your work, it strikes me that most of the figures are, facing the viewer, and then you have these two really prominent female figures that have their backs to the viewer. And I was just wondering if you had thought about what exactly is going on with that dynamic.
Like with the backs being turned.
Yeah, just that everything, the stand that we're looking at is all faces looking at us, it's just a bunch of faces looking at us, and then these two really prominent, female figures that you spend a lot of time talking about in really interesting ways, and, that we don't see their faces, that their backs are to us.
Well, beginning with the formal qualities of the mural, Diego Rivera is rooted very much in the Cubist tradition of painting. So it not only acts to synthetically as a way to kind of frame the piece, it kind of allows for you to have that like bold outline that you would traditionally see in that, along with including his own individual muralistic style. On top of that too, there's the inclusion of the braids that I talked about, and I mean the two photos that I showed, or the two paintings that I showed afterwards were probably one of the at least 20 of very detailed images of women's hair and women working things with feminists. But there is a distinct like choice to have a direct comparison between the two, and having those on the ends is like an aesthetic choice. Also, Diego Rivera had like kind of a habit of putting things a little off center, and it's kind of like this like Alfred Hitchcock thing of there's like something that's hidden in there, and he even has a cameo in a lot of his portraits, in a lot of his paintings, including this one. So I think it's kind of his own style, and then it's those formal qualities surrounding on an image, because this is one of nearly at least, I don't know the exact number, but at least 20 in this Secretary of Education headquarters building, not including not only Rivera's work, but Secretary and Orozco's work as well. So it could have just been a border, but then he wanted to include that comparison as well. Thank you.
Any more questions? Yeah.
Question for Lucy. I love your feet. Wonderful to bring up the data in Japan. I wonder if you see a way to make a connection between the work we were talking about in the early 20s and movement in New York, that had a lot of Japanese individuals, including Yoko Ono and Yaya involved. And whether that may be mentioned, I'm not sure if you looked into that, but if you yeah, I have thought about it, and I almost put it into the shorter paper, but it was just too much time, especially with showing a portion of the song, because it was important to hear it. But
Director's cut.
exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, there are more than just one connection, but it is a movement that has not just like fizzled out, and it gets researched pretty much every time there's a big problem that people want to vent about.
Yeah, I mean, I see influences in a lot of like contemporary Mexico in the 90s as well. That would be a really interesting connection to make. Yeah.
I just thought of something. To go like, those two women also represented.
I was actually gonna prod you into this, yeah.
Also, later on, especially, seen as like a tourist destination. So it's doing like that comparison of like the indigenous like traditions that are ingrained in Mexico that want to be preserved, but then also including that globalization. So it's like the two of those coming together, and this is innately related to this.
Okay, welcome back. We have a wonderful second panel. This will have 3 speakers. And I'm going to invite Professor Liu up to introduce the first speaker.
Hi, everyone. I'm Yun Chen. I'm assistant professor in the Department of History of Art and Architecture. It's my pleasure to be here to introduce our next speakers for the second session. Our next speaker is Victoria Precious, and her paper topic is Amphoras, the effects of trade on the morphology of pottery, written in Professor Lisa Mahoney's God and Mortals class.
Trade is a crucial component to the growth and economic stability of any country. It provides its city with the necessary substance and income needed for development in the ancient world. The city's manufacture and their local potters were one key players in trading, as their vessels were both used as shipping containers and commodities. By analyzing the amphorae found on cargo holds excavated from Greek shipwrecks and comparing such pieces to decorative amphorae not used for transport, we can piece together how trade affected the very forms of the amphora through its manufacture, decorative amphoras, and functionality. Amphoras were narrow-necked handled vessels known for holding precious liquids such as wine, oil, water, and perfume. Their ceramic vessels composed of fired clay, terracotta, and tempered. Their outward appearance is distinctive on account of their special features produced by the clay and their elongated features. The amphorae used for shipping wine shown certain fixed characteristics such as 2 opposed handles, a relative narrow neck, and no flush base, but usually a tip which can be used as an extra handle. The structures of the amphoras, specifically the narrow base, is the result of the ship's storage capacity, suggesting that its narrow base provided a safer and efficient mode for storage in the cargo hold. Thus, the narrow form of the amphora, specifically its base, is related to its function as a shipping container that was modified to fit within the cargo hold for ease of storage and handling. The importance of manufacturing regarding pottery, as explained by scholars Calvo Nuvenzi, who says that tradition was an important aspect in the production of pottery. It is considered the beginning of the vessels morphologically, rims, bodies, base, and handles. Yet these defining features are not the only attributes that evidence the hand of the potter. As specified by art historian Jonah Mendez, individual potters and painters occasionally sign their wares with their names and verbs designating the maker Epson and Posen or the painter Epson. A rather interesting attribute of the amphoraes used as shipping containers is that they were not decorative. The amphora vessels that have imagery on their surface are vessels instead found within tombs. Athenian workshops, for example, created decorative amphoras decorative vases specifically for the Etruscan dead. The Etruscan vases found within the Etruscan tombs were considered part of the tomb's decorative aspects and were expected to be coordinated with the other decorative features seen within the tombs such as the painted walls and sculptures. These decorative features were part of the amphora's function as a vase needed in the afterlife. Shipping amphoras did not need to be decorated because they're disposable and inexpensive to produce. Thus, the lack of decoration is a result of its function as an expendable vessel. Demand is a key component in trading and in the morphologically of pottery. According to Elizabeth Will, the form of the export amphoras is a response to the demand in needing a container large enough to hold bulk quantities, but small enough to be handled by one person. This suggests that the structure of the amphorae would have been affected by the increase of demand, which is likely when looking at the evolution of shipping vessels. Starting between 3,300 to 2000 BC, a multitude of vessels were used in transporting goods across the Mediterranean, such as the torpedo jar, rope sung jars, and the Levantine vessel. The torpedo jars were clay jars that, like the amphoras, were used to carry liquids such as oil. Their appearance, as the name indicates, is shaped like a torpedo and bears a similar appearance to the elongated form of the shipping amphoras. However, due to its singular composition, the torpedo jars lack both a neck and handle that characterizes the export amphoras seen in Greek shipwrecks. Yet, the elongated feature seen on both the tubular form of the torpedo jar and the shipping amphoras suggests that the elongated form was a necessary composition that aided in the functionality of the vessel. By the 4th millennium BC, a new type of container was crafted, a rope-slung jar and handleless, loop-handled, or ledged storage jar. The structure of these jars kept its elongated features and handleless form until the later Levantine vessels, evolving through the span of the 3rd millennium BC by using loop handles for ease of carrying. The Levantine vessels, unlike the torpedo jar, incorporated a loop handles within their structure of the vessel. The form became larger as the large size made it easy to transport or standardized, elongated to prevent breakage, and were comb decorative to reinforce the walls of the jar, improving the overall strength of the jar. This development suggests that the handles were needed for ease of transporting on and off the ships. A likely possibility that these changes, as stated by Andrew Bevan, marked the evolution of a long-distance trade throughout the millennium, as an effect caused by the development of sailing ships and to meet the demand of trade. The relationship between trade and the morphology of the amphora's physical features is seen in the amphora's elongated body and neck. The closest form of the amphora is the Canaanite jar. The vessel is the predecessor of the amphoras and were designed to be used on ships due to its durability and shape, making it easier to be stacked. This is an important observation as it explains the relationship between the trade and the structure of the amphoras. It accounts for the physical features of the amphora exemplified in its elongated body and neck. These are crucial components in the shipping pottery, as these containers needed to be strong enough to survive the journey and be able to store large enough quantities of amphoras safely within the cargo hold. This is illuminated by Stella Domestica's statement regarding the container's requirement being based on the suitability of storing firmly and effectively. The handles on the amphora and neck are comparatively larger and narrower than the handles on the base of the Canaanite jar. It is reasonable, therefore, to assume that the form of the amphoras were, when compared to its predecessor, the Canaanite jar, were improved upon based on its shape being easy to store. These changes correlate with Domestica's statement explaining that the effect of trade on the morphology of the wine amphoras are seen in its elongated body shape and narrow bases, as these forms make the pottery easy and more effectively to store and provide minimum casualty within the ship. The contents within the pottery vessels play a role in the amphora structure. To trade, there must be a demand, which then affects the form and the characteristics of what is being sold. Indeed, demand, explained by Calvo, is the main component that explains the existence of pottery altogether and its effect on the ceramic's technical, structural, and decorative features. The shipping of amphoras correlates with Domestica's previous statement on the contents between the amphora, the connections between the amphora structure and trade, though through its elongated body shape and its narrow bases, therefore the amphora structure is modified for ease of transportation and to meet a high demand market. However, that is not including what may have been stored within the amphoras, as the contents would have affected the vessel's shape. DNA analysis points towards these vessels holding a variety of substances such as ginger, walnut, juniper, as well as mint, thyme, and oregano. This suggests that the ceramic vessels such as the amphoras were used to ship other consumable materials. And so the vessel's shape had to be crafted to hold other substances. This recalls a theory that ties into the storage purposes proposed by Domestica, the containers being suitable for stowing firmly and effectively. This also calls to mind Cavell's statement that pottery, at least in the pre-classical times, prioritized the functionality of the vessel holding foods and liquids. And so one can conclude that for pottery used for the storage and the pottery transported for trade, form was dictated by the ease of storage safely, regulations, and made to hold items, food and liquid that were in a demand. This emphasis on the form and the export amphoras were displayed in the demand for the container fit to travel and carry bulk quantities. The lack of decorations on the vessels relieved the potter's intention in distinguishing the amphora's functions, and when looking at the evolution of shipping vessels, specifically the torpedo jar, the Levantine vessels, and the cannonite jar, for example, marked an evolution of long-distance trade that developed the form of the export amphoras exhibited in the handle and narrow structure of the vessels. Thus, the morphology of the export amphoras is altered by the multitude of variables that circle back to one aspect, and that is trade. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. Okay, our next speaker is Anna Arborizer, and her paper title is The Constructed Pre-Raphaelite Maiden in Art and Life, written in Professor Marin Sullivan's 19th Century European Art course.
There we go. The pre-Raphaelites found the beautiful female subjects for which they are characteristically known and admired in the pages of Greek, medieval, Shakespearean, and biblical literature. They were popularized through contemporary interpretations by writers like Alfred Lord Tennyson. The artist's own executions of these literary figures on canvas would come to be visually classified as a particular type of woman that became pervasive outside art and within society in the second half of the 19th century in England. Art historian Anne Anderson calls this subject the high art maiden and credits pre-Raphaelites with her popularity. This essay aims to explicate not just the ways the high art maiden was depicted within art, but also the ways in which the lives of female pre-Raphaelite models and artists, Elizabeth Siddall in particular, were constructed in relation to the concept of the maiden. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, or PRB, was a group of young English visual artists, writers, and critics who formally organized from 1848 until 1853. They rejected the Royal Academy of Arts curriculum that privileged the art of the High Renaissance and instead sought to create their own alternative artistic practice inspired by late medieval and early Renaissance art. This paper utilizes the term Pre-Raphaelites to refer to members of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood and to those influenced by them in later decades. The high art maiden was just as much a product of Victorian England as it was a product of the Pre-Raphaelites. In the 19th century, the segregation of men into public and political spaces and women into private and domestic spaces was sustained as the patriarchal bourgeoisie became the dominant social class. As the enforcement of familial structures necessitated women's presence in the home as wives and mothers, women's femininity subsequently became entwined with her gendered roles in the home. There was a real fear that women would begin to gain independence and infiltrate the public sphere. In fact, bourgeois women had already begun to pursue professional careers and were increasingly involved in political efforts like the Married Women's Property Acts. The high art maiden then arose from the Victorian male's imagination as a product of his anxiety. She's the embodiment of an ideal femininity constructed under patriarchy.
In art, the high art maiden is characteristically passive and vulnerable. She is generally depicted with long, thick hair, often red, and in medieval dress, although painters often chose to leave her underdressed. Often she looks sickly, pale, and emaciated. Her gaze, Anderson writes, is staring sightless and out of the picture. Artists effectively immobilized her, illustrating her as dead and dying, ill, sleeping, or imprisoned. She is effectively sentenced to silence. In other words, the high art maiden is a bourgeois Victorian man's perfect woman. One of the most popular literary sources visualized by the Pre-Raphaelites and their associates was Alfred Lloyd Tennyson's ballad, The Lady of Shalott of 1842, a loose rendition of the Arthurian legend of Elaine of Astolit. The Pre-Raphaelites almost always rendered two moments from the text in their art: the Lady of Shalott imprisoned within her tower, and later her body floating down the river to Camelot. Both exemplified the high art maiden in differing ways. William Holman Hunt contributed his rendering of the Lady of Shalott to the 1857 book known as the Moxon Tennyson. His drawing depicts her imprisonment and the moment the curse begins to take effect. Hunt returned to the same drawing nearly 30 years later and spent 15 years creating a revision in oils. To Christine Poulsen, the viewer plays the role of voyeur, witnessing this charged moment. The Lady of Shalott, tangled in the thread of her own creation, struggling to free herself. This invasion of space is an assault. She describes the violence within the image, the swirling, agitated lines of flowing hair and thread. And the lady's feet and arms are bare, her hair lost and wildly disheveled. The force of the exploding web seems to be almost stripping her, as it binds up her dress to reveal her petticoat and pushes her sleeves up to her arms. This assault that Hunt depicts is just the beginning of the Lady of Shalott's end. As the lady escapes from her tower, she is subjected to the curse that takes her life. Heavily influenced by the Pre-Raphaelites, John William Waterhouse treated the story of the Lady of Shalott in 3 different oil paintings, each one depicting a different moment. His earliest and most famous one is named after its source. In this painting, the Lady of Shalott begins her journey down the river towards Camelot in a boat. She will die before she gets there, a consequence of her overstepping the curse placed on her, but she brings with her life's work, the tapestry she was tasked to create. Nonetheless, Waterhouse's subject, exudes helplessness. She appears motionless and her gaze is blank. It is unclear exactly where she is looking. The white of her gown separates her from the background of the composition and accentuates her isolation from the outside world. Those who know the story, and many people who saw the painting in its time would, have already imagined her death. These depictions of the Lady of Shalott are representative of the high art maiden type. Both Hunt and Waterhouse emphasize her long reddish hair, thin figure, and pale skin. In her death, the Lady of Shalott's youth and beauty will be forever preserved, as will her silence. At the end of the poem, as Sir Lancelot gazes down at the lady's corpse, he cannot help but comment, "She has a lovely face." With that sentence, she is lessened to nothing more than a beautiful object meant to be looked at. For the Pre-Raphaelites, the high art maiden was especially tied to their own constructed identities of the female partners, friends, and relatives who modeled for them. This sentiment has been maintained within the historical canon. Amateur art historians and professionals alike have been fascinated with the melodramatic chronicles of the Pre-Raphaelite brotherhood, the relationships they maintained with one another and the women in their lives. This treatment comprises the majority of writing on this topic. Its sensationalization denies these women the ability to be known as anything other than a Hunt, Rossetti, or Millais model or muse in the canon. While their proximity to the male artist is given the primacy, their own professional and artistic contributions to the movement have been consigned to a sentence or two within a significant portion of the literature. Griselda Pollock writes, "Close scrutiny of written texts in which women artists of the period are represented reveals a growing discourse on the woman artist who is not the embodiment of reason and learning, but the spectacle of beauty, sexually desirable, and artistic inspiration, a muse." Pre-Raphaelite women are thus depicted as the source of the PRB's inspiration, but unable to conjure that inspiration for themselves. This is the case for Elizabeth Siddall, a Pre-Raphaelite artist who modeled for many of her colleagues, and also happened to be romantically involved with Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Her presence in the dominant art historical narratives is almost synonymous with the high art maiden. For many, Elizabeth Siddal was the embodiment of the tragic maiden trope in both art and life. But it cannot be assumed that this version of Siddal is a reflection of reality. It is a carefully constructed product of the writings of William Michael Rossetti, Dante Gabriel's brother, generally cited as the PRB's biographer. W.M. Rossetti's works have, for so long, been the authority scholars turn to in their studies of the Pre-Raphaelites. Although these texts were assembled nearly 30 years after the original group was active. In comparison to historical evidence from Elizabeth Siddal's life, Pre-Raphaelite accounts and interpretations are misleading at the least. Siddal was molded into the ideal artist model, beginning with the dropping of the L in her surname, because as W.M. Rossetti writes, my brother always spelled the name thus. Elizabeth Eleanor Siddal, one of 8 children from a working class family, now became Lizzie Siddal, the youthful and beautiful, yet enigmatic and consumptive wife of Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Pollock goes as far as to separate them entirely. Lizzie Siddal functions as a sign. More than the name of a historical personage, it does not simply refer to a woman or even woman. The meaning of Lizzie Siddal as a sign, therefore, is not of Elizabeth Siddal and does not refer to such a person. Rather, it renders the altered name Lizzie Siddal a signifier in and for a discourse about the establishment of male dominance and female subordination. In other words, the creation of Lizzie Siddal is representative of a patriarchal culture where women's identities are fashioned by men and who are made to be passive. John Everett Millay's Ophelia, for which Siddal modeled, is an example of the ways that Lizzie Siddal's image contributed to the high art maiden. Drawing inspiration from Shakespeare's play Hamlet, Millay's depicted Ophelia in the aftermath of her drowning. Her eyes stare lifelessly into space, and her mouth gapes, the color fading from her lips and cheeks. Siddal is identifiable by her long, voluminous hair. It has been said that the unknown chronic illness she suffered from and an addiction to laudanum was responsible for her gauntness. For Millais, it seemed it was her poor physical health that made her the ideal model for the portrait of deceased Ophelia. In many ways, the female Pre-Raphaelites saw the disservice their male counterparts were doing to them by reducing them to a trope and sought to make revisions with their own artistic practice. Emily J. Orlando explains, in the case of Pre-Raphaelite women, the recuperative act of self-portraiture is as much about reclaiming their own representation as it is about exposing and dismantling the ideology of the aesthetic for which they have served as symbols. She uses the example of Elizabeth Siddal's self-portrait from 1854. Siddal represents herself as radically different from her appearances as a high art maiden. Unlike usual depictions where she is painted as youthful and sorrowful, Siddal captures her own seriousness and professionalism. She is dressed very modestly, her hair is pinned behind her back, and the neckline of her garment stops at her throat. Perhaps the most striking element of this piece is her denial of passivity. Siddal's gaze meets the viewer as she refuses to let them see her for anything other than herself. It is therefore necessary to consider the female Pre-Raphaelites when examining the ways their male counterparts depicted women. Their unsympathetic imagining of the high art maiden is directly and metaphorically reflected of Victorian sentiments about gender, affecting an entire class of Victorian women, and more specifically, the lives and legacies of the women who sat for them. As Elizabeth Siddal herself wrote, "There I will ask of thee a boon, that I may not faint or die or swoon." Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Our next speaker is Jackson Devaney, and his presentation title is Crafting the Grave, Teresa Magoya's Representations of Death, written in Professor Delia Casentino's State of Death class.
Perfect. Before I begin, I would like to provide a content warning as the presentation contains images that could be upsetting to some, and please feel free to excuse yourself. Alrighty. Aspects of death in art, while not necessarily common, are not altogether unusual. Elements such as skulls or hourglasses are examples of memento mori, which is Latin for remember, you must die. Such memento mori have appeared in many European art pieces over the past millennia. However, the world of art is not limited to Europe. Specifically, death is infused in much of the art of Mexico and other Latin American countries. Contemporary Mexican artist Teresa Margolles elevates memento mori by fusing art and corporeal elements to explore the violence of death. Her incorporation of body parts from human corpses brings forth a contemporary outlook on death that is representative of the traditional Mexican view of death, but furthers this perception by using fresh death to make a modern social commentary. Teresa Margolles was born in 1963 in Culiacan, Mexico, a city in northwestern Mexico, where she graduated with degrees in forensic medicine and communication science from the National University of Mexico, located in Mexico City. It was there where she later helped to found the artistic collective Semifo in 1990 in cooperation with 3 other artists. It was there where she began her artistic career. While continuing her day job working in a Mexico City morgue, it is the morgue as well as crime scenes that has been the source of materials and medium for her work. Although this may seem macabre and artistic inspiration, Margolles' work reflects the unique relationship that Mexicans have with death. The 20th century Mexican author Octavio Paz said, death also lacks meaning for the modern Mexican. The Mexican, in contrast, is familiar with death, jokes about it, caresses it, sleeps with it, celebrates it. It is one of his favorite toys and his most steadfast love. Viewed from this perspective, and in this time of building a national Mexican culture that recognizes death as an inherent part of life, it can be argued that Mexicans are not afraid of death, but accept it. However, a critique of Paz's interpretation of the Mexicans' relationship with death is presented by anthropologist Miriam Lamrani when she suggests that the relationship between death and Mexicans has evolved since the time of Paz. She argues that they are not familiar with death because they love death, but because it surrounds them. She states, thus, the Mexicans' happy relationship with death, exalted as part of the national image, did not stand up to scrutiny in the face of people's lived experience. Rather, the discourse of death, as the quintessence of Mexicanness, suppresses the suffering of people damaged by the reality of a country where senseless death has become commonplace. This almost jocular intimacy with death sells a colorful version of Mexico to the dazzled foreigner, but it fails to take into account the bleak socio-political situation of the country today. Lamrani's view is that Paz romanticizes the Mexican perspective on death, but conveniently overlooking the violence that so frequently accompanies death in Mexico. Margolles seems to understand the views of both Paz and Lamrani. In her work, she honors the Mexican appreciation of death while acknowledging the harsh realities of life in Mexico today that may precede a person's demise. To do this, she uses fresh death or elements thereof. This fusion is seen in Lengua, or tongue, a Margolles piece that displays on a small stand the severed, pierced tongue of a deceased young heroin addict. The tongue was acquired with the permission of the man's family in exchange for the funeral costs being paid by the artist. The tongue was preserved via plastination, a technique in which the liquid and fat of a specimen is removed and replaced by plastic polymer. The displayed tongue carries a variety of meanings. One meaning is the erotic connotations that have been placed on the body part when independent from the body. A professor of Hispanic studies, Dr. Julia Banwell, suggests that Margolles presents lengua as a fetish object. The erotic connotations of the tongue are furthered by the fact that the tongue is pierced. Banwell also suggests other meanings that the tongue carries, as lengua can also mean language in Spanish. First, Banwell notes how aspects of speech and communication are attached to the organ and how its severed status is symbolic. As a drug addict, the man was part of a marginalized group in society. Perhaps his addiction had left the man destitute, but circumstances suggest a lack of generational wealth. His family could not afford his burial costs. This loss of his tongue, Banwell argues, represents the plight of others in similar situations. She says, His tongue is standing for people who effectively have no voice. Granting representation to his contemporaries is a reminder to the viewer that drug addicts are people too, despite the negativity that is attached to their lifestyle. Their ostracism from society robs these people of their ability to tell their stories. Death may have silenced the young addict, but metaphorically, his tongue has been stilled by society. Although there are multiple suggested meanings for the Margolles piece, this is not uncommon in art. In art history, historians must attempt to extrapolate a meaning of work through historic, social, and cultural context. Consequently, myriad interpretations can emerge. In contrast, in more modern work, the artist, him or herself, can explain to the viewer the meaning of the piece. From Margolles' perspective, this tongue isn't meant to be a representation of the man, but instead his literal last remains. The literal significance of lingua is a material one. That voice has been literally cut off, as the tongue is effectively useless without a connection to a live body. Being the organ of speech, its preservation gives the young man a voice one last time. The inclusion of human remains in Margolles' work is done to show how the remains represent the lack of a physical live body. In a large installation from 2009 at the Venice Biennale Mexican Pavilion titled "De que otra cosa podríamos hablar," or "What else could we talk about?" Margolles uses the blood of murder victims as the physical reminder of the lack of live bodies. The exhibition was installed in the 16th century Venetian palace, the Palazzo Rota Ivancic. She employed the fresh death aspect of blood, which she had acquired from the crime scenes of murder victims, on canvases that she had used to soak up the blood. The soaked canvases were then dried and subsequently embroidered with gold thread that captured messages from the Mexican drug dealers and criminals called narcos that were found at the murder scenes. These canvases were titled Narco Mensajes, which translates to narco messages. Once complete, these sheets of canvas were then hung on the walls of the installation. On the floors of the pavilion, a solution of dried blood and water was used to repeatedly coat the floors. This decorating was done by Margolles' assistants and by the family members of murder victims, whose blood was being used in the mixture. The repeated action of mopping the solution on the pavilion floors creates, in essence, a scab. This portion of the installation was called limpieza, which means cleansing, purification, but in a healing context. There's a duality in mopping here. The act of mopping on a layer of blood and water that then sticks to the floor, leaving a crust in which footprints are made by the viewers. And the act of mopping up then displays the futility of stopping the violence. This was meant to be a reversal of the word cleansing, where every time the mop is used, another layer is added. This reversal shows that the attempts to stop violence within narco and gang culture are futile and only makes things worse. This act of creating an environment where the blood of victims surrounds the people who go into the exhibition forces them to keep in constant contact with the victims. Doing this presents the opportunity for the viewer to experience a sliver of the reality of death that Mexicans experience on an everyday occurrence. The privilege that is afforded to Margolles in regard to her position as an international artist is not easily obtained. Her ability to represent Mexico at the Venice Biennale, which is a large-scale event where artists put up contemporary exhibitions in an international scene, grants her the ability to portray Mexico in the reality that it finds itself in. Rather than sugar-coated with nationalistic pride or a bureaucracy that attempts to glorify the relationship of death in Mexico, she presents the reality of narco violence and death that clouds the country. She ignores the social pleasantries of being polite in her art, commanding the viewer to experience a portion of reality that the people of Mexico live in. She bridges the gap between bodies both alive and not, as well as countries both east and west. Having them come together to understand the reality that Margolles has seen, the viewer could ask why. Why am I forced to undergo this experience when entering and going through the artist installations? The answer is a rather simple one. To understand Mexico, one must face the reality of death, that it isn't often, if ever, pretty or enjoyable. It's unpleasant and unfair, without regard for individuals. Death takes what it wants, when it wants. Incorporating death in her art, Teresa Margolles demonstrates the realities of Mexico Instead of using subtle symbols that nod towards the sensitive subject, she employs literal remains of deceased humans to show the reality of death and its constant presence in life. Her work is representative of the contemporary view of death in Mexico, while still acknowledging the more traditional view. Her inclusion of fresh death provides a commentary on these views, allowing for her viewer to get a more in-depth and realistic view of modern Mexican culture. Thank you.
We'll invite Leslie back up to provide some questions for our speakers. If I could have the speakers sit in the front. Wonderful.
Victoria, I think it's so impressive that your topic is both so specific and broad. And honestly, I don't have a question because I have never even encountered these vessels in my life. But I think that you're touching on something that's really interesting, that is sort of a thread throughout like the field of art history, which is the form and function question. And I think that's really fascinating. And so I'd like to see where that continues to go. I also think it was really interesting to see human ingenuity and need and sort of the constant wants to decorate as well, and how that sort of evolves with function. If that makes any sense. Yeah. Anna, pre-Raphaelite maiden. I think it's really interesting the question that you posed at the end, or not the question, but the argument you were making towards the end, which was the problem of the muse in art history, as well as how you can also further sort of take that apart a little bit. And I think it was really interesting that this muse in particular was trying to take her image back. And I think that there's something more that can also be developed there. I would like to know a lot more about how she was sort of reclaiming her own image and her own name as well. Do you have anything further to say?
Yeah, I feel like this is such like an ambition. There's so much I can talk about. But Elizabeth Siddell, she was an artist and a poet as well. She's working class. And so she was kind of, it's said that she's discovered by the Pre-Raphaelites, and that they kind of like are encouraged her artistic talent, and like they are the source of her talent.
Of course they were.
Yeah. And so I think it's mainly through her art. I wanted to bring in another piece that is her own rendition of Lady Shallot, which just kind of connects everything together. And the moment she chose, and the way that how she depicts the lady is not very active, you know, and not you know, kind of taking initiative for herself. So there's that. I could bring in, you know, other models and but it's just like there's a lot to talk about.
Yeah. But I also think that the Pre-Raphaelites are so like this one group that is not very researched as well, and or in comparison to the bigger picture of art history. So I think that there's, I don't know, the way that the images that they made seem to be so antiquated, even at the time. And yeah, I just think there's something really, really interesting about her reclamation of her own image and the sort of feminist ideology before feminism, or at least as we know it in a way. Okay, Jackson. Thank you for talking about Margolles. I will say that I did have some problems with the argument. I think that there's a major problem with generalizing Mexicanness in this way. I don't think Mexicans appreciate death and violence in the way, in the way that you're talking about, in the way that Margolles is depicting the work. I think that can be seen and can be problematized with all the protests that are happening currently with feminicides and with the activism that is happening on the ground in Mexico. And I encourage you to look at that. I think that what Margolles is actually doing is criticizing the state and criticizing the state's involvement in that violence that is normalizing it on the ground for people and which people are reacting to. I also think that there is a sort of culture and currency of something called the Páginas Amarillas, which is a comment on the lack of proper journalism in Mexico, because journalism is also part of the corruption and the narco violence is part of the corruption. And this is all part of the bigger system of a corrupt state. I also want you to probably take a look at, not probably, but to take a look at Cuauhtémoc Medina's Abuso Mutuo, in which he talks about this sort of relationship between the United States and Mexico that is something that is one dependent upon the other. And if you look at the narco trafficking and the narco violence, it also has to come from demand. And so there's this relationship with the state and the United States, as well as the Mexican government, that I think is a really important part of the narrative here. Octavio Paz also wrote a really famous, many famous things, but one line in particular, if I can get it right, is that he said something that unfortunately Mexico was so far from God and so close to the United States. And that is a really important part of the narrative of the 90s as well, particularly when Margolles was working. And I want you to look at other artists that have kind of worked with imagery like this that continue to this day and are very young, actually, like Andrew Roberts, Joaquin Segura, Minerva Cuevas, who she was friends with, and Eduardo Avaro, she was also friends with. These are all artists sort of problematizing these issues of the state. That said, I'm going to turn to you, and I want, because I'm sure you have comments on this as well. Why did you want to look at Margolles in this way? And did you think of sort of extracting it from the sort of narrative romantic myth of the macabre?
So a lot of it is like, I was all introduced to all of this, where Kara had spent like a year and a half doing in Mexican art. I was like popped right in last fall. And so that's kind of where I got started with it. I like Teresa because she was like kind of weird. Yeah, like it's like obviously. That's kind of why I liked it. And so it was just, I was trying to, from the lens and how the course of the setup, that's kind of like the connections that I had made. And talking about like again pause, and then Margolles was at the towards the end of the class, and I actually changed my paper topic to her because she was at the end. But I don't know, I forget the main question.
I mean, you're also kind of like at a disservice here because I live in Mexico and I know these artists.
Yeah.
I live this every day. So thank you so much for your courage. And I just would say the same thing then, like try to be really careful about avoiding that big R romanticization, especially of a developing country, especially when that has such a complex history and where violence is, I mean, it's really heavy, is what I will say. Yeah. And any questions from the audience? Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, like did you find any evidence in research that this form, the Greek form, was based on earlier forms that were developed in the literature? I know exactly what those that I have seen. I have not found anything that's been found, but I have continued to research back into the correlation. When I was studying, I remember from your class, and I'm like, I recognize this form from the Montessori village, and I'm like, there must be a connection, but I haven't seen any type of article that points like this. So the second part of my question is, it's fascinating that the for depends on the functional object. I wonder if you saw any of those early answers that had scratch or cord mark decoration, and or whether any of those earlier things found their way into clay, which the later one did together. So I wonder if there's something that may be something that you want to do. I don't know. Not necessarily damage, but wear and tear in the ocean, so I can't confirm how they work out. But it's definitely something that I would like to do. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody. Question for Jackson. I think it was super interesting. And it's all kind of artists that I'm really interested in. My question has to do with something I've been thinking a lot about, which is that there's obviously a relationship between art and what's artificial, right? Like art is in artificial. There's a book by Dan Graham, interesting masonry artist, where he says something like the problem of 20th and 21st century art is that artists want to do something more real than art. Sort of paraphrasing. And so I wonder, the way you presented Margolius' work is that it was about like showing reality, showing how things really are, not sharing things. That's super interesting. But it's art, right? So it's artificial. It's not an actual murder, though the materials are taken from one. As the viewer, you see it at a second remove, and so I'm curious if you have any thoughts about. I think this is a problem for all sort of contemporary art. What the relationship is between the artificial and art, and then this sort of the reality that we're trying to be put back in touch with, but through the mediation of art. That makes sense.
I think especially going to, as the more modern we've become, art has become anything and everything. But specifically with that, I think what makes her so interesting is like, she's like as close as you can be without actually being there. I mean, it's not like, again, it wasn't just a picture of the tongue, it was the real tongue of this dude. Like that's, I think, it's as close as it can be. So, and again, it was preserved, so there's that artificialness to it too. But I think ultimately, I mean, yeah, it was just, she gets as close as you can get, I would think, and then who's to say?
So I think building on that, even though but she's choosing, like she's choosing specifically the tongue, and you did a great job of explaining symbolism with it. Also, what she did with blood is not what most of us, that takes artistic expression and other things just done differently than what those of us out of our world are used to.
I mean, one comment, I was reading my paper this morning to one of my roommates, and I was talking about how with these pieces with basically these canvases with blood on them, he's like, wouldn't that stink? Wouldn't that smell? And he's like,
It did, yeah.
yeah, it does.
Yeah.
So again, it helps to really transport you into this very real thing.
A biohazard, people.
It was a percentage, it was mixed with a certain amount of water so that it wasn't a biohazard issue. But I think another thing, the comments with Margolius in particular is also the corruption. What does it take to get the blood, right? It's also about the process. It's about her paying the funeral costs for this person who died so that she could get the tongue. That would never happen in the States, right? But what are the steps it takes to make that happen in Mexico? And that is part of the corruption, the cycle of corruption that exists as well, which I think is a really interesting angle that you could also look at. Sorry, yes.
At the end, you got to Sibelius, and she's a painter herself.
Yeah.
I don't hear much about her women painters or women artists, and so I'm wondering how many, was she a singular example, or are there others, and are they, I'm also thinking of mid-19th century women as painters, they're not supposed to be professional painters.
No.
So are they working in other materials or other mediums, or what's going on?
There was a whole slew of women that were associated with Raphaelites. Most of them started as models and became muses and became romantically associated with the Raphaelites, which is really problematic because it totally erases who they were. I know there are several painters, even there's several pages in there, there's a sculptor who's related, Christina Rossetti, who was the Rossetti brothers' sister. She was a poet. I know one woman embroidered, which is again like so interesting and like thinking about feminine craft and making it high art. So there is so much information that it's like hard to grasp, which is why I kind of stuck to one here.
But I also think it's interesting of who's telling those stories, right? Like what we know of them and their lives is that they became muses and lovers, but like
Yeah.
they were also artists in their own
Yeah,
ways.
so little is known about Elizabeth Segal.
And
They-
it's who tells the story of art history. It's typically
Yeah,
them, right?
it's William Michael Rossetti,
Right.
who was writing the biography, and then everybody was looking at his work, you know, and so some of the papers I was writing was looking at census records and like talking about how changing the L in her name is such a violent act because of the like, because the name is different, it's hard to figure out who they are in census records. You know, like they probably weren't like maliciously doing that then, but like the implications that it has for like identifying these women and, you know, placing them where they came from, you know, which is not situated with the pre-Raphaelites, you know, they're their own person.
Right. Yes.
I also have a question for Anna, just like discussing sort of that you touched on it, but like, can you sort of expand, as something with like no background in this, like on the intersection of the aspect of class and the way that these women are brought up by these, essentially by these men in their own.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because a lot of models were working class because a bourgeois woman would not be seen as a model, you know what I mean? It was a working class profession. And so that was the way that the pre-Raphaelites, you know, who pre-Raphaelites are mostly from bourgeois backgrounds. They say they're against the like Royal Academy of Arts, but several of them went there. You know, like I don't know that they completed their education there because, anyways. But I am reading super interesting things about class and how important class is because Victorian era bourgeois was like using, you know what I mean? And so there's a difference in femininity. You're talking about like the bourgeois woman who's kind of virtuous and pure and blah blah blah. Whereas like the working class woman is seen as, you know, like a fallen woman, you know, somebody who's painted and in that sense. So there is definitely like a class aspect that I think isn't talked about a lot. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Students and everyone, can we have a round of applause for them?
Thank you all. It was great. Congratulations. Well done. Thank you.
And we'll invite Professor Mark Tolassi, chairperson of the department, to come up and we'll set you free.
Yeah, please do.
All right. Thank you. Right, well, wow, what a bunch of polished presentations this evening. Yeah. Great. So it's my honor and privilege to award our Outstanding Alum Award. Thank you. Recognizing those who've made us particularly proud in their endeavors after leaving our program. Tonight's recipient is Leslie Moody Castro, who I had not had the pleasure of meeting previously because she graduated before I was hired at DePaul. And in fact, graduated before we were an independent department. You guys have the fun of taking all of these art history classes without the heavy load of studio courses that used to be the case when we were a conjoined Department of Art and Art History. So nevertheless, my colleagues in the department all remember Leslie with fondness, and her biography in the program certainly speaks of her active role in the field.
So it gives me great pleasure to present Leslie with this award. Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
So I also have the honor, thank you, of presenting our annual essay prizes for the best paper written in the past year in any 200 or 300 level HA course, and for best paper written in the capstone course. Before calling the recipients forward to receive their awards, I'd like to thank Professor Yen-Chen Lu, with whom I worked in selecting the recipients. The non-capstone paper prize is awarded to Nora Ryan for her paper entitled Pausanias, Why Do We Listen to Him? Stay there. Which was written for Professor Elisa Mahoney's course HA 316, Gods and Mortals, the Art of the Ancient Greeks. In this paper, Nora compares the Temple of Zeus in Olympia with what the 2nd century Greek traveler Pausanias wrote of the monument. So what it actually is and what he wrote of it in his renowned work, Description of Greece. Through this comparison, Nora elucidates the reliability of Pausanias as a contemporaneous observer and his value to modern art historians as a source for interpreting ancient Greek architecture. Here. All right. Now the capstone paper prize, which is awarded for the best prize written in the capstone, best paper written in the capstone course, is also awarded to Nora Ryan for her paper. You couldn't go anywhere. You had to stay here, that's right. For our paper entitled Passion and Pain, Francisco Goya's Rise to Modernity, originally written for Professor Maren Sullivan's course 239, 19th Century European Art, and which you've heard eloquently presented here tonight. As the winner of our capstone paper prize, Nora will also have the opportunity to publish her paper as our department's representative in DePaul's undergraduate research journal, Creating Knowledge. So congratulations. Thank you. And finally, I'm happy to present certificates to our presenters this evening. But before I do so, I have a few people to thank for tonight's event. A great deal of work went into making this symposium happen, and I'd like to recognize a few of those responsible. First and foremost, Professor Mark Polad deserves recognition. For the wonderful job he's done in teaching our capstone course once again for the 3rd year in a row. He's well practiced. And beautifully preparing our students for their presentations this evening and planning the symposium itself. So thank you, Mark. And also for our fabulous department assistant, Eileen Corona, for doing all the actual legwork to make this happen, right? She's the one who makes everything happen for us. As everybody in the department knows, she keeps us all in line and on schedule, which is not easy. I'd like to thank all the professors who guided our students. They refined their papers in this capstone course, and as well who spent an additional evening giving feedback to our students as they practice their presentations. Our students benefit from the support of our professors. I'd like to thank the museum for hosting us once again, right? And I think we're kind of seeing increments here, building increments. Last year was our first year back here holding the symposium in the museum, which is where we want to have it. It's we're directly connected. This year we're back for a 2nd year, and we've got food and drinks this time, right? Bye-bye, COVID. So this is, it makes us happy to be here in the museum, and the museum is, supports our students, gives them places to work,
and to see art, to engage with art. It's wonderful to have this institution connected with the department, so thank you. And finally, to all the parents, we owe a debt of gratitude to the parents for sending us your kids and trusting them to us and supporting them throughout this whole process. So thank you to you as well. All right, so now I get to present the certificates. So Jackson Devaney. Whose name I accidentally mispronounced for an entire quarter before, and he let me go with it, and then corrected me one day. I was, oh. Isabel Kempner. Let's see here. Anna Oberweiser. Victoria Pashis. Nora Ryan. Isabella Sarasano. And finally, Kara Super. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you for the presentations. This has been a wonderful evening. And now may you enjoy the food and drink.